Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight to this our 32nd, I think, Grassy talk. We're very lucky to have David De Angelis here to give me an adrenaline spike with the file sharing, but here we are. Before we proceed further, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and that the grasslands of Melbourne are also on Wadawurrung and Bunurong land. And since GPN is now a statewide organisation, I should uh, just say that there are like 10 traditional owner groups that are spread across the Victorian volcanic plain and more across the whole of Victoria. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of all of those peoples and anyone First Nations people here today. And just say that, Victorian Treaty is a fantastic thing, and I hope as a consequence we will be able to move forward a bit and start to undo some of the terrible damage that we have done. Yes, the good works of tens of millennia that we've managed to undo in a brief period of occupation and invasion. So, yes. So, let me tell you very briefly about David, if I can find my relevant document, which of course I can't. David is president of Frogs Victoria. He teaches fauna surveying and monitoring at Holmesglen. He's a consultant with ABZECO, and he does a lot of frog-related stuff with La Trobe University as well. And he's particularly interested in the conservation and ecology of reptiles and frogs, and he's done habitat management plans for several threatened species across southern and central Victoria. I'm sure David can tell you more about himself. If you like, do please put your questions in the chat, and or probably feel free just to interrupt David as we go along. I'm sure that will be fine too, just to keep us all on our toes. But let me now just share my screen, and David, you can tell me when to do stuff, and hopefully stuff will happen.
No worries. Very good.
There we go.
So far, so good.
So far, so very good.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian, and for inviting me along to spiel to everyone about a combination of topics that I confess are very close to me. So from the perspective of ecological land management and restoration, I won't say too much about myself because you've already done that at length, Adrian. Fantastic introduction. Thank you very much. But among the many, of the several things that I have done in the past, started out on bush crew, working in ecological land management, very, very early in my career. And that gave me an appreciation for the habitat aspect, the flora side of things, obviously. But even before then, as far back as I can remember, interested, passionate, possibly even fair to say obsessed with all things slimy and scaly, but wildlife and wildlife conservation more broadly. And so having worked in land management and that ERM space kind of gave me an appreciation, a greater appreciation for the value of managing that other aspect, the living aspect of their habitat as far as the flora is concerned. And much more recently, And I should say, not in large part to any sort of work that I've necessarily been involved with, but others, the likes of who I'll mention as I go through the presentation, work that's been done more recently into aspects of the preferences, let alone requirements of some of our threatened grassland reptiles, are starting to change our appreciation or understanding of what they need in a grassland habitat to enable them to survive, let alone thrive. And it's a bit different from perhaps some of the assumptions or what we've expected in the past, thinking about what a threatened grassland frog or reptile might need in its habitat. So I'll touch on some of those nuances. Next slide. But to start with, by way of, well, I'll try and make it a very, very brief explanation or background to set us up. As a proportion of threatened species in Victoria, well, actually, this is just looking at raw numbers. So for all of the vertebrate fauna in Victoria, obviously including reptiles and frogs, they're not perhaps doing as badly as what we can see the raw numbers of threatened mammals and birds are. But that changes when we look at the percentage of threatened species, thanks Adrian, relative to the number of species in each of those groups that occur in Victoria. So we can see that as a proportion of the number of species present in Victoria, there's a greater proportion of threatened reptiles and frogs relative to birds and mammals. Having said that, fish are in an even more dire situation, but slightly further from my wheelhouse. So we'll go forward talking about the situation that our reptiles and frogs find themselves in. As far as the reptiles go, at least, relatively recently, or at least as far as when conservation situations get revised or updated for things like reptiles in Australia, recently, there was a reassessment of all the threats faced by threatened lizards and snakes across the country. And unsurprisingly, habitat loss comes out on top. I don't think that'll be a surprise to any of us, let alone impacts from livestock and domestic animals through grazing, pugging, eutrophication, etc. Things that we're all familiar with. Fire is an interesting one because at least in terms of reptiles, it can be a threat in two different ways. So fire at too high frequency or intensity can obviously be a threat. But for some reptiles, a lack of fire or frequent enough fire can also be a threatening process. And I'll touch on that, particularly in relation to a couple of threatened reptiles on the volcanic plain that we're probably at least superficially familiar with. And then, yeah, some most of those other factors are going to be familiar to us. Otherwise, albeit as far as the threat that they pose to reptiles, according to various experts in Australia, not having as greater impact as those ones that we've just mentioned. Although I will touch on weeds as well. Yeah, maybe I won't say much more about weeds at this point, but it won't take me long before we dive into that one. So, next. And I only wanted to highlight some attention that was brought to some of these issues, well, relatively recently, but 10 years ago now, by Nick Kleeman, who's fairly considered an authority on threatened reptiles and frogs in Victoria. But touching on some of the less well understood threats as well. And particularly in the case where some of those less understood threats have a potential to be influenced or altered by those of us involved in management of habitat for threatened frogs and reptiles. So I mentioned weeds as an example, and perhaps otherwise. It's actually, well, yeah, as Nick highlighted in his opinion paper, a point for probably consultants working in the ecological space as well as land managers, so far as considering what actually constitutes suitable habitat for some of these threatened species. That might be different from what we used to think provided suitable habitat for them. Right, we'll jump ahead. And at least for, I guess, the key threatened frog species that's well known from many of Victoria's grasslands, the growling grass frog, it's thanks to Jeff Hurd that we started to get an appreciation and understanding of what they need in terms of their terrestrial habitat. This is based on some of the work that Jeff did at the beginning of his PhD, looking at microhabitat preferences when growling grass frogs are hanging out on the land. And somewhat surprisingly discovered that in the case of both still or isolated water bodies, lakes, dams, ponds, etc., but also in the case of slow flowing water bodies where this species exists, so pools and perhaps deeper runs within creek systems and rivers. Their preference in terms of the terrestrial habitat tends to be rocks and bare ground. And fairly enough, the question was asked, well, is that just because the frogs might be harder to locate in dense vegetation? So the data might be biased in that way. But Jeff was conscious of that, and to an extent, he was able to account for it. For example, spending a greater amount of time searching in the denser vegetation. But it wasn't until later that Jeff, among others, gained an understanding of why the growling grass frog might have a preference for more open microhabitats on land. He also looked at their breeding habitat preferences. And so for growling grass frog, like the majority of frogs in southern Victoria, but not all, breeding habitat counts as standing water where they lay their eggs. And obviously the tadpoles are restricted to until they're able to turn into frogs. And in terms of that aquatic breeding habitat, Jeff came up with his very simple diagram just to show that it improves with increasing submerged vegetation cover. So the submerged aquatic plants or macrophytes are the ones that growling grass frogs use to lay their eggs on and provide pretty critical habitat for the tadpoles in terms of protection from predators but they're also a food source, and surfaces on which the tadpoles are feeding, for example, on algal and fungal and bacterial films and that sort of thing. Not just for growling grass frog, but that submerged aquatic habitat provides important breeding microhabitat for several of the other frog species around Melbourne that are a bit more common, for example, the common froglet and the southern brown tree frog, etc. as well. And I should say, just very quickly before we move on, well over and above any habitat value that floating vegetation provides, although absolutely growling grass frogs will use floating vegetation, but it's also true that too much vegetation covering the surface of the water can be a negative for them. But particularly when we talk about things like azolla, the native aquatic floating fern, let alone duckweed or anything like that, and let alone emergent taller vegetation, things like kumbungi, typha and phragmites, common reed. They can cause issues as well if their cover's too high in a wetland. And we'll move on to explain why. So this came about much later in Jeff's research when he discovered, and I should say this happened concurrently with other people looking at what influences bell frog persistence in wetlands, mainly through the University of Newcastle. And that was the discovery, or maybe confirmation's a better word, that higher temperatures and increased levels of salinity inhibit the amphibian chytrid fungus in wetlands. And that has significant implications for the growling grass frog. So in fact, I'll explain very briefly the amphibian chytrid fungus, which was introduced to Australia, and the earliest that it's been recorded impacting on frogs here was in the 70s. The growling grass frogs are particularly highly susceptible to that disease. Not all frogs are. But the disease tends to be at least inhibited by higher concentrations of salt. This is where it's all a little bit above my head, because chemistry was when I was at uni, until it became relevant to frogs. Suffice to say, bore water, perhaps to a concentration that farmers would give to dry livestock or dry sheep. So maybe about the 3,000 or so EC mark is enough to inhibit chytrid fungus, or at least slow it down. But growling grass frogs are tolerant of those sort of levels of salinity. And in fact, more, as far as is known, than any other species of frog in the Melbourne area, or probably southern Victoria, where they've looked at their salinity tolerances. It's much higher in the growling grass frog, just as well, given how much it suffers from chytrid fungus. Likewise with water temperature, the threshold's about 25 degrees in terms of the point where chytrid slows down or stops growing. Much higher than that over a prolonged period, and it'll die off. So lucky for growling grass frogs, they also don't mind wetlands that are at higher temperatures. Obviously, those wetlands won't be at that higher temperature at all times of year, though, and that leads towards considering other aspects of how we can enhance the thermal quality of their habitat to try and suppress or maintain chytrid infection at low levels. Next. And that's what Jeff tried to demonstrate or show in this otherwise what looks like a fairly complicated diagram, but very simply showing that when you, for example, reduce overshading woody vegetation cover or other emergent cover around a wetland, it improves the situation for growling grass frogs because it has an inhibitory effect on chytrid fungus through increasing the water temperature. And the same with salinity, as I mentioned. High concentrations of salinity to a point inhibit chytrid fungus and have a positive effect on the probability of growling grass frogs persisting in a breeding habitat. I should mention as well, maybe unsurprisingly to us, there are other factors that are important for growling grass frog persistence at a wetland, which include things like connectivity, let alone hydro period, or the amount of time that the water is present in that habitat. Next. And so it results in very interesting situations like this one as an example. And I should say, probably is a bit of an extreme example, but nonetheless, an example of where growling grass frogs, is probably fair to say, are thriving in the Shangri-La that is Caroline Springs. One of the main water features in that part of Melbourne happens to be totally artificial. Not only that, but half of the lake's concrete. And I should say, though, there is some connectivity in this case with Cororoit Creek, which no doubt provides, albeit a very narrow corridor, for growling grass frogs to populate the lake from the creek. But they do breed in the lake. And although there isn't any more much submerged aquatic vegetation, seem to be using the patches of perhaps shorter emergent vegetation around the edge, things like juncus, and I think that's Baumea or whatever it might be referred to now by the botanist. But those emergent rushes provide sites that the frogs can lay their eggs, but they're submerged bases, and shelter for the tadpoles. But as far as the rocks go and the concrete ledge around the edge of the lake, provide opportunities for growling grass frogs, no doubt, to warm themselves up. And although we don't know, because to my knowledge, nobody's tested for chytrid in this lake, is possibly a safe assumption that that habitat's providing a bit of an inhibitory effect for chytrid fungus. And no doubt it's probably a bit salty as well, given the subcatchment that it's in. Not necessarily a situation that we might have traditionally thought an endangered frog would hang out in. But it's those properties that are probably allowing it to persist here. Next. And just as well, in some ways, at least for the species benefit, that growling grass frogs aren't too fussy about the type of plants that they necessarily use as habitat. So in this case, I only included this photo because it's an unusual, I think, or at least interesting example of not only a threatened frog using an introduced plant, but in this case, the growling grass frog's introduced as well, because this was taken in New Zealand, where the species has established itself with human help. So a case of introduced frog on an introduced plant, just emphasising that it's much more the structure that the vegetation provides that's important over the species of flora. That's not to say, for those of us involved with land care or revegetation with friends groups, or in a professional sense in the ecological contracting industry, that we don't necessarily have a want to re-veg using indigenous species. It's just to say that the frog, likewise with the reptiles that I'm about to talk about, aren't as fussy as some other aspects of the biodiversity, or necessarily as we are in terms of the types of plants that they're using. It's much more about the structure. And so for these two species, the swamp skink and the glossy grass skink, which I included because although, for example, on the Victorian volcanic plain, there aren't too many places where either of these two species occur, although there are some, perhaps at the fringes. They are reasonably still common in some situations, in particularly grassy wetlands, and especially where these species occur more inland in Victoria. Although, for what it's worth, I'll mention when they occur much closer to the coast, both the swamp skink and glossy grass skink will use salt marsh. But again, it's because of the structure that those habitats tend to provide rather than the plant species that occur there. Right, next. And this is a perfect demonstration of that. In this case, on the Mornington Peninsula. So on the left, what I've called Site A, low-lying area, periodically flooded, so a swampy area, but dominated in this case by sweet vernal. And in some other cases, things like phalaris or kaituyu, those exotic moisture-loving grasses, as opposed to the site on the right, Site B, which was nearby to Site A, but entirely dominated by indigenous flora. And in this case, mainly Lepidosperma, sword sedge. Looking at both examples, you would expect swamp skink to occur there. However, after the better part of a year of surveying at these sites, it was discovered that there were a reasonable number of swamp skinks in the site dominated by exotic grasses, mainly the sweet vernal. And none were detected at the site dominated by indigenous sedges. That's not to say that they weren't necessarily at the indigenous site. But if they were, at least in very low numbers. I should say the situation was reversed at other locations on the Mornington Peninsula that were surveyed at the same time as these sites, where you had high numbers of swamp skinks in swamps dominated by indigenous flora, and none would turn up at other sites that were dominated by exotic flora. But it was a mix. So again, demonstrating that there's something else going on other than the species of plant that are influencing whether or not the species occurs or persists at a site that to our eyes otherwise provides suitable habitat for them. I'll only otherwise quickly mention that this scenario has been shown to both expert botanists and herpetologists, and nobody's necessarily been able to pinpoint or suggest why there might be this difference, why swamp skinks are apparently absent or at low density at the site dominated by indigenous sedges and much more abundant at a site that's dominated by exotic grasses in this case. It might have something to do with the hydro period at each site or something that we're not aware of. Next. An even more extreme example, perhaps in the glossy grass skink, which over and above the swamp skink seems to have an ability to relatively rapidly recolonise disturbed areas. And this is an example from the southeast of Melbourne, around the Shangri-La that is Dingley Village. Heavily modified drainage line, traditionally deepened and straightened, and filled on either side. So the original surface soils no longer existent, although in some areas nearby, and now colonised by kikuyu and canary grass, phalaris, and full of glossy grass skinks. Obviously, being able to recolonise this area from areas nearby. So they've held on in the broader landscape somehow along the drainage line, and since moved into these very heavily disturbed areas that are now providing habitat for that threatened species. Everything else about the habitat is perfectly ideal for them. So, like the swamp skink, this species requires sun to be able to access the ground so that they can bask. So sparse overhead vegetation, if not almost absent tree and shrub cover, but a dense cover of grasses or other very low growing vegetation to provide some cover for them, but still allow them to bask in the sun. Next. And again, just another example, but one only slightly closer to Melbourne, in the Bayswater area, still with some indige flora values, but with plenty of exotic grasses and other flora mixed through, in a site that unfortunately no longer exists, at least in this form, because unsurprisingly, these are the sort of areas, at least close to Melbourne, that are a focus for, in this case, industrial development. All right, next. And sometimes well-intended actions can have impacts that are just as threatening for a species like this. And this is where it becomes very difficult necessarily to think about solutions or alternative ways of managing habitat for species like the glossy grass skink. So a recent example of riparian planting that was done in Melbourne's southeast under a capital works program, not least of all for other threatened species like the dwarf galaxius fish, which was the case here, or at least very close by to this area. So when we do, perhaps I'll refer to it as more traditional revegetation through planting lots of trees and shrubs, especially in along creeks and other waterways or around wetlands, and necessarily spray out mulch or jute or weed mat over dense exotic grasses like kikuyu that were, in this case, providing habitat for a known population of the glossy grass skink. We know in this case that it's had the result of pretty well excluding that species from this area, because that critical low-growing dense habitat's been removed, and once, so that's mainly trees and shrubs are established, it creates a type of habitat that glossy grass skink can't really use anymore. It's not to say that it's impervious to them. They'll still be able to move through that sort of dense shrubby and treed habitat, but it's certainly nowhere near optimal habitat for them, or areas of core habitat where they're likely to reside going forward. So it's actually perplexingly a significant impact on the habitat for that threatened reptile. It's not to say, though, I will mention that these sort of plantings of trees and shrubs, which are in part or in some cases done because it's a very good way of suppressing that weedy, grassy ground cover and establishing Indigenous cover reasonably quickly or effectively, and more cheaply than if you concentrated on transitioning that weedy, grassy understory to an Indigenous grassy ground cover. That can still be done in other areas, but the suggestion is perhaps not so much in areas where we know or at least suspect threatened species like the glossy grass skink and swamp skink occurring. So they're still valuable, these plantings, obviously for mammals, sugar gliders, possums, birds like fantails and thornbills. But we now know that they're a negative where you have a threatened species like the glossy grass skink. Next. And so, given that, an example of one of the few friends groups that have embarked on trying to specifically replicate the kind of habitat that the glossy grass skink and the swamp skink like, but not having done this sort of thing before, although granted it is it's not an unfamiliar concept in the grassland space. As you well know, obviously, Adrian and others who work in grasslands, doing so. In what they did was they scalped an area adjacent to a reserve where the glossy grass skink was known to occur. This is done in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, close to that Bayswater site, dominated by paspalum. Prior to that, doing surveys to try and establish whether or not glossy grass skink were already present. It turned out they probably weren't, or in very low numbers if they were. And so they then went ahead and with council assistance were able to scalp a very small area to trial reseeding, but actually it was mostly done through tube stock or cells, hycos, to replant Indigenous low-growing grasses and sedges and rushes to try and mimic habitat for the species, but from the perspective of using all Indigenous species that provide that dense, low-growing structure. And I can say after about, it was probably, when was this done? In 2018-19. So just a bit older than 5 years, and albeit in a very small area, done very successfully. And so now the First Friends of Dandenong Creek are looking into the future to the potential to expand this out a bit further, and perhaps one day be successful in the glossy grass skink recolonising this area, although as far as it's known, it hasn't happened yet. But at the very least, a really neat small example of the type of restoration that could be done to benefit a species like the glossy grass skink, as opposed to what I described as some of the more traditional re-veg or thinking that goes into planting out areas like this. Next. And so on the VVP and in other areas of grassland throughout Victoria, including the Alps, for the moment anyway, because this is a species that's likely fairly soon to be finally split by the taxonomic experts on it into multiple. And so there'll be an alpine tussock skink, and the VVP will have its own species. On its own, the species at the moment is considered threatened in Victoria. Once it's split, of each respective species will be even more threatened, obviously, than what the species is recognised as a whole. But just a very quick example of an area west of Melbourne where tussock skinks had recolonised a heavily disturbed area, again, that had partly been filled and dominated by serrated tussock and some Chilean needlegrass. So in a similar way to those wetland or grassy wetland specialist reptiles, we have the tussock skink doing a very similar thing out on the VVP. Next. And the striped legless lizard, although not to the same extent in terms of its ability to recolonise areas. So we know from work that was done in Canberra that very probably the striped legless lizard rate of recolonising habitat only happens, the very specific number was about 12 metres per year of reoccupying habitat. Probably much more slowly than an animal like the tussock skink, which shares its habitat with this species. This is a really interesting example that I couldn't help but bring up of an escarpment on a creek west of Melbourne that was planted up with river red gums and a saltbush. I'm pretty sure the saltbush was Rhagodia parabolica, which is technically a threatened species, isn't it, Adrian? Is that right? Maybe the fragrant saltbush, whichever one that is. Not knowing that this escarpment was occupied by striped legless lizard. Surveys happened post revegetation. The focus of the revegetation on this escarpment was to try and create or replicate a escarpment woodland. The only issue with that, having then discovered striped legless lizard there, it was recognised that once those saplings matured and overshaded that area along with the saltbush, it would remove the suitable grassy habitat for striped legless lizard. As a result, council and the land management contractor changed their revegetation plan for this area, which is shown on the next slide. Fairly dramatically, removing the eucalypts and most of the salt bushes, and instead incorporating a lot more planting of indigenous grasses like themida and ostrastipe, speargrass and kangaroo grass, rather than trees or shrubs. So going forward, hopefully meaning that this area will continue to provide suitable habitat for striped legless lizard, and it won't be overshaded by all those trees and shrubs. Again, I should say that there are areas along the creek nearby that already have decent tree and shrub cover. And it's not to say that for other reasons So there's a lot made about greening the West and 20 million trees projects, and for wanting to address sustainability issues and issues that affect biodiversity as well, not least of all climate change, but reducing the urban heat island effect, for example. The argument from this perspective is perhaps that can still be done, but much more selectively, or in areas that aren't going to impinge on spots where we have these threatened species that are wholly reliant, or at least overwhelmingly reliant, on grassland habitat. Those plantings can take place nearby in areas where we know, or at least are fairly sure, these threatened species don't occur. Next. And just another very quick demonstration of, in the case of striped legless lizard, two areas that we know were occupied by the species. One, an almost pure stand or field of kangaroo grass. The other, almost wholly dominated by Chilean needlegrass. And as I said, in both cases, striped legless lizard was present. Would have been breeding in both locations. But the structure, at least for this species, is more or less equivalent or similar enough at both sites that it could persist at both. So what they are particularly after is the tussock structure, with some intertussock spacing. And that actually leads on to another really good point into this slide, which is that no matter whether the species is exotic or native, if it has a tussock structure, for a species like the striped legless lizard, that's the critical aspect, regardless of the species. And that's what was shown in a study on another very small lizard species, albeit in North Queensland. But as far as its habitat requirements, similar or maybe a bit analogous to something like the tussock skink. So in this case, rainbow skinks up there. This study was done by an honours student at James Cook Uni, who put this probably not grassland specialist, but at least a species that likes to live among grasses in enclosures with an exotic species, greater grass, which strangely enough is a themida. Somebody's bound to know more than me, but apparently I think it's annual or a seasonal grass at least. So it dies back for part of the year. I think that's right, at least I think that's what Graham Lorimer told me. And they had areas in those enclosures that were covered with indigenous tussock-forming grasses. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the skinks went for the indigenous tussock-forming grasses, but they discovered it wasn't because those grasses were indigenous. It's because those grasses are tussock-forming. And they discovered that by artificially clumping the greater grass, because naturally it grows in tall thickets, is my understanding. But by artificially clumping the greater grass, they created a habitat that the skinks use just as readily as the indigenous tussock grass habitat. So demonstrating that point really neatly. Next. In terms of maintaining that tussock structure, it's thanks to likes of Michael Scroggie and Gary Peterson and colleagues, who at the time that this was published were based, and Michael still is based at the Arthur Eiler Institute, finding that, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you apply both fire and grazing to grassland as a form of biomass management, more often than not, it can have a detrimental impact for a species like the striped legless lizard. But also, the suggestion is the tussock skink, although that data wasn't reflected in their publication. Whereas applying each of those biomass reduction techniques or disturbances on their own was found not only to not have that negative impact, but in some cases can be a positive. And that's probably not going to be surprising to us, given that these species are grassland specialists and rely somewhat on an intertussock structure, a moderate amount of biomass management or reduction. Even if fire or grazing were necessarily applied together, it probably does depend, we could reasonably assume, on the intensity or the degree of each of those disturbances as to how likely the striped legless lizard is to persist in an area. And so we have examples both where areas of grassland are burnt, and for one reason or another, the striped legless lizards that were known to occur there have disappeared for several years afterwards, haven't been detected with ongoing monitoring. But at other sites, they've hung around for some reason, and it possibly has something, at least at the early stages after a burn, to do with shelter, whether there are soil cracks, spider burrows, or surface rocks that they can shelter from fire, let alone the availability of prey or suitable habitat for them much longer post-fire. Next. All right, so to sum up very quickly, I won't belabor most of these points because I've touched on most of them already. But in terms of habitat management, probably the first thing to consider, as far as the threatened frog habitat, particularly for growling grass frog goes, is not overshading areas known or suspected to provide breeding habitat for this species too much by planting overhanging trees and shrubs or taller emergent vegetation. Those habitat types can still be included in smaller quantities, but a much greater focus, at least for the growling grass frog, on planting submerged aquatic vegetation, being critical sites for egg laying, as I mentioned, let alone the habitat that the tadpoles are pretty well wholly reliant on until they turn into frogs. And keeping, as a general rule, perhaps about half or at least a third of the water surface clear of vegetation, cumulatively taking into account floating as well as taller emergent and that woody overhanging vegetation. Only otherwise, as far as that thermal aspect goes, Melbourne Water, in their habitat design standards for growling grass frog, this is why they have an emphasis on including about 20% cover of rocks around new wetlands that are created for this species to try and provide that thermal benefit from chytrid infection. All right, next. Whoops. Oh, next slide. Oh, no, it's not wanting. Oh, there we are. Very good. And so, unsurprisingly, and again, I'm not going to spend too long going over this because I have already. But in summary, for thermal reasons, but very different to the growling grass frog. In the case of the lizards, it's about their basking requirements, not over shading areas that we know are being used or suspected to support grassland lizard species, or at least nothing that's going to grow too tall, above half to a metre high. And so where we might actually, just as importantly, considering whether, let alone how, to necessarily manage areas dominated by exotic grasses like serrated tussock, Chilean needlegrass, phalaris, and kikuyu. So some of those grasses we know are weeds of national significance and legislated to be controlled in Victoria under the Catchment and Land Protection Act. So there are many land management plans applying to areas of grassland that require those exotic grasses to be controlled. So perhaps, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but for those of us who are land managers, there might be others who, you know, thinking creatively or outside the box, might know of or think of what could be done to reduce the cover of those exotic grasses where that's a desire, without necessarily excluding or pushing out these threatened grassland reptiles. So a gradual transition, which can be difficult over time, let alone working with land management budgets and time restrictions that many of us are probably familiar with when it comes to working in these areas. Or necessarily targeting particular weed species that aren't being relied on as much as for habitat by these threatened reptiles. So prioritising aspects of weed management that aren't going to be a negative. Yeah, all right. I think I'm pretty well done, Adrian. The last slide includes just, well, most of the references and studies that I touched on. Other than that, happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. It was really interesting to get into the weeds of it all, if you pardon the poor pun. I'd be interested in just starting off by, I suppose, saying that it is the role of exotics in the habitat of threatened species. Like we've met this with golden sun moth and things like that before, and it is a real thing. And it's and in places like the Western Grassland Reserve, we're never going to get rid of the weeds there. We're always going to have this exotic native landscape that we have to manage. So it's to my mind incredibly important to be thinking about the role of these sort of blended landscapes, I suppose, where the habitat is provided by all of these creatures. I was reminded too, like in the Geelong Strategic Assessment is back carrying on its EPBC thing, and the areas that have been offset from that are generally habitat that's weedy habitat, the striped legless lizard and golden sun moth. So the arguments you're putting forward for like gradual transition and that sort of thing are like really important arguments, in that we, like, if we perhaps pushed those arguments a bit more a couple of years ago, we might have saved another paddock or so of golden sun moth or striped legless lizard from the effects of the Geelong Strategic Assessment, because people just look at weedy environments and go, get rid of them, go offset somewhere else. And it's a real...
Yeah, that was, I'd made very briefly early on, Adrian, the point about relevance to consultants as well as land managers. And so all too often, and I can't be a hypocrite, Adrian, because I am a consultant, and I can't claim that I haven't necessarily made oversights or mistakes way back in the past, and might still when it comes to species that I'm not as familiar with. But I'd at least hope that as consultants, if we're not sure about the value of a paddock to provide habitat for a species like golden sunmoth or striped legless lizard, that we might at least consult someone who has more knowledge in that area, or might have a bit more of a clue. And we know, there are absolutely cases where those oversights have been made in the consulting world, but also the land management world. So there are several situations in Canberra that I know of that are actually published case studies by Anita, I can't remember her surname, who did her PhD on golden sunmoth through University of Canberra. And she mentions a few scenarios where areas of Chilean needlegrass were totally sprayed out. And Chilean was prevented from necessarily very quickly regrowing, or for whatever other reason, it knocked out golden sunmoth. And although those areas were still, they were conservation areas intended to remain as grassland, the situation became that they lacked that threatened species because of the initial well-intended restoration effort that was applied. Yeah. So I again, it's so hard. Because Chilean is, as we know, a species that needs to, under the CALP Act, it's not at least in Port Phillip region, it's not a mandated to be removed wherever it occurs, but at least prevent the spread of, I think. And it is a weed of national significance.
Yes.
So, where you have a management plan that says eradicate, control or manage Chilean needlegrass in an area of grassland, and there's golden sunmoth there, what do you do? I don't know that any of us have a perfect answer.
No.
Yeah.
Stuart Proper has a question, I think it's on the same lines, that a lot of the decisions to revise planting seems to have resulted from later identification of grass endangered species. So how well do we know the habitats before planting occurs?
Yeah, that's a great point, especially for something like the glossy grass skink or a tussock skink, because I don't blame land managers or consultants necessarily for being unaware of that. What constitutes suitable habitat for these species when they may not even know that these species exist? Especially in the case of glossy grass skink, it's only now getting a lot more attention because it's, in no small part, through an awful lot of work that's been done on that species just recently through Monash Uni, David Chappell and Jules Farquhar and colleagues. But also because that species is looking to be federally listed under the ABZECO Act, perhaps fairly imminently. So the final decision was due to be made at the end of October as to whether that species gets listed as vulnerable under the ABZECO Act. And we're not aware yet of what that decision's going to be once the minister gets that off his desk.
Right. It's always, I mean, it's a bittersweet thing, isn't it? I find myself wanting it to be listed as vulnerable because that means we might save a couple more patches, but it's bad news that it is listed as vulnerable, of course.
Yeah. And so very quickly on that species, as an example, how do you know that it occurs in an area? It's very, very difficult. to tell it apart from other very small brown stripy skinks, let alone to detect it in the first place. And it might involve doing things like using roof tiles as artificial shelters in surveys in a similar way that we do for striped legless lizard. We know that that's effective to detect them, but then you might need animal ethics approval and a research permit under the Wildlife Act from DECA although some people get away without having that bureaucratic paperwork in place. We certainly can't endorse it. Luckily, actually, the people at Monash discovered for glossy grass skink survey, passive survey works as well. You can observe them when they're out basking, particularly early in the morning, and perhaps later in the afternoon. And all the better using binoculars from a distance, because they are very cryptic in their behaviour, but also very shy or nervous, as you might expect for a small skink that likes to expose itself by basking in the sun.
Okay.
So that's a possibility. Walking transects or walking around the margins of suitable habitat, looking out for them. Other than that, taking a precautionary approach, and if the elevation in the landscape is suitable, the grass or habitat structure otherwise is suitable, and it hasn't, for example, been recently ploughed or very regularly mown on every few weekly basis. We know, for example, I'll just mention very quickly for glossy grass skink, slashing areas that are slashed for fire management or pasture, up to 4 times a year, maybe, even up to perhaps 6 times a year. So every couple of months, perhaps, or even more frequently in spring when the grass is growing obviously a lot more vigorously. But perhaps those areas are left in summer and winter when the grass isn't growing as quickly, are absolutely occupied by species like tussock skink and glossy grass skink.
So David, in terms of, like, you mentioned grazing and fire as different options, is there for general skink kind of love, do we prefer fire, like if it's done in a particular way, or is grazing perfectly fine? It's like, I imagine the risk of getting crushed by a cow's hoof is less than the chances of being burnt to death by a fire, but
that's a great question, and I don't know that I've got the answer, but I think the best answer we have is probably through the work of Mick Croggy and Gary Peterson and Jeff Hurd that I referred to in relation to striped legless lizard, and applying those two methods of biomass management, fire and grazing. And I did read the thing a while ago now, and I probably won't remember exactly what it says about whether one's necessarily better than the other or in different circumstances.
Okay.
But if anywhere or anyone's likely to touch on that, it would be in that paper, that research. From an anecdotal perspective, my own observations, either fire or grazing is probably better than no biomass management in some cases. And in fact, I won't steal too much of Gary Peterson's thunder, but in the recent talk he gave to Grassy Plains Network, and as you're well aware, Adrian, and probably some others, that's probably a great example of a site where, for the species I didn't touch on, the grassland euless dragon, it seems to do well, with some form of moderate biomass reduction. In that case, it's sheep that are, and in fact, that area has been grazed for 50 years, or as we know. But there are other areas on that property where the grass is much taller or perhaps a bit more thatched, where, there may not be so many grassland dragons being detected. And other areas that are being grazed at a particular point in time much more intensely, and likewise may not be quite as suitable for the dragon.
Yes.
So and also a good example of a site that is largely dominated, at least in no small part, by exotic grasses, and in that case, serrated tussock.
Indeed. Other people, do you have questions? Peter, you've made a couple of comments there about the benefits of tussocks and so on, which is fantastic, and with the potential of burning and so on. Do other people have questions for David? Just shout them out, I think, at this point. Let's not put the chat in our way. So I've got another question about the thermal impact. So you mentioned that raising like the temperature of water and so on can be a good way of keeping down chytrid fungus and so on. What sort of impacts does that have on the broader biota and so on? It's like there'd be a lot of species that would perhaps not like warm so much. I'm sure there's always trade-offs, but is there a particular trade-off here?
Yeah, there very well might be, and let alone for salinity. So, quick example, the suggestion for Melbourne Water in the habitat design standards for growling grass frog that they've put out, I think mentioned on the salinity side, kind of related to this, it's another factor that influences chytrid for the frog, filling wetlands perhaps with groundwater, which is naturally more saline, necessarily, rather than tipping bucket loads of salt into our wetlands and denuding them, which, as you say, Adrian, might have negative implications for other aspects of the aquatic biodiversity or that share those habitats with the growling grass frog. Temperature is an interesting one. I don't, saying that, you're probably not influencing the temperature that much, or to the extent that you still have areas, and still important for the growling grass frog, I should say, providing a bit of cover and vegetation around the edges of the wetland. Even short vegetation growing along the margins, bog plants and short emergent plants that aren't going to block out too much sun, getting down to where growling grass frogs are mainly hanging out, will still provide a bit of a buffer from high temperature extremes. But then you've got these rocky beaches or areas that are providing a thermal mass around a particular point of the wetland that the growlers can hang out in and perhaps have a go at shaking off the infection, if not withstanding a high degree of infection from the start as a preventative measure. Is found to be much more effective as a prevention than a cure.
Right.
At a wetland that already has chytrid fungus, for example.
Oh, that's interesting. Sarah Johnson makes the point, thermal diversity matters, which I think,
exactly.
We have a mosaic of all sorts of things, and we have a mosaic of heat as well across our spaces.
I should maybe very quickly touch on a really interesting study that was done for Monash Uni a few years ago that found on the salinity front, bell frogs, So they actually looked at the very closely related green and golden bell frog. So closely related to growling grass frog that in eastern Victoria, where they overlap, they hybridise.
Hmm.
But they otherwise experience chytrid fungus in a very similar way.
Hmm.
It's a major threat to both species. That green and golden bell frog, and it would be interesting to see if this is the case, but we can probably assume that it might be with growling grass frog. Out of any other frog in Melbourne, have the highest salinity tolerance. But not only that, the Brian Carney, the student at Monash, who looked at this a few years ago, tested salinity tolerance of those bell frog tadpoles, comparing it to southern brown tree frog, common froglet, common spadefoot toad, maybe one or two other species, spotted marsh frog or something like that, and found that, as you might suspect, with increasing concentrations of salinity in the lab, the tadpoles of all those other frog species, spadefoot toad, spotted marsh, common froglet, their survivorship decreased with increasing concentrations of salinity. In the bell frogs, it was totally reversed. The tadpoles had higher survival with increasing levels of salinity. It's not known why, but at least hypothesised maybe if the founding individuals, the parent frogs of those tadpoles, back a couple of generations, came from the wild where there's chytrid. Chytrid acting as a selective pressure, a driving force to higher salinity tolerance might mean that those species are now able to persist at high levels of salinity than other species of frogs that aren't as affected by chytrid fungus. But that's just a guess at this stage.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? The way evolution might be shifting the species distribution and so on because of this fungus.
Rapid adaptation.
Yeah.
Potential project for any poor students that are
Okay.
looking.
Very good. Well, if no one has got any more questions, we does anyone have any more questions? Do you want last chance gone? No? Okay. Well, let's thank David very much. It was fascinating and very informative and thoroughly useful talk, and I hope we'll be hearing more from you down the track one way or the other. So yeah, thank you very, very much, David. The rest of you, we let's take it's 7:56 now. Let's just take a break until 8:05 and come back for a general Grassy Plains Network meeting. We've got lots to talk about. I do urge you all to hang around and so on and talk, I don't know, MSA audit or whatever else is going on. But yeah, thank you, David, very, very much.
No worries. Thanks very much, Adrian.
Yeah.